Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today we're going to take a look at the 25th in my series on the Spiel des Jahres, or German Game of the Year award winners. And today we're looking at Klaus Teuber's Barbarossa. And this is the 1988 winner of the prize. The game is essentially a party game where players are going to sculpt clay objects and then try to guess at the identity of each other's objects. The game has some really weird rules. It plays from 3 to 6 players in about... The box says 75 minutes. That's absurd. It's really about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the number of players that you're playing with. And the box says it's for ages 12 and up. Again, that seems kind of high to me. I think certainly a 10-year-old would be able to play the game. So let me take a minute to show you this oddball party game, and I'll come back and give you my thoughts on it. Okay, so here is a game of Barbarossa set up for 3 players. You'll notice that each player gets a pawn, which they'll be using to move along this track, which represents a wizard's cave, and they will start on this space next to the door. Players also get a scoring marker, which starts on that space, and a marker to indicate how many gemstones that they have. They'll start with 12. They can never move above 13. Then each player will get, in their player color, a set of modeling clay, which they'll use to sculpt a number of clay sculptures, which they'll place in the center of the table, or the center of the board, rather. And these are going to be, essentially, you could pick any word when you start the game off of this huge list of words that's included with the game. Or, as you play more, you could just sculpt anything. And it has to be a one-word answer. So players will do that and place those in the middle of the table. In a 3 or 4 player game, you'll sculpt 3. In a 5 or 6 player game, you will sculpt 2 each. So once players have done that, the game itself will actually begin. Oh, I should mention players also get 3 of these curse cubes, as well as a pencil and a pad of paper that they'll use to communicate with other players. So on a player's turn, they're going to simply move along this track, and they could either spend gemstones to move an exact number of spaces. So for example, if this player, the red player, let's say they just wanted to go to this space, they would spend 1 gemstone to do that and move forward 1 space. Or they could roll the die and move that number of spaces. So those are your 2 options to move on your turn. And then you'll execute whatever is shown on the space that you land on. So I'll go over those spaces. So first of all, there are some bad spaces, these dragons and these ghosts. If you ever move onto a ghost space, every other player will get 2 points. So for example, blue moved on there. These 2 players would get 2 points. The dragons work similarly, except every other player only gets 1 point. So those spaces are just negative spaces that you want to avoid. These gemstone spaces, if you move on those, you simply take 1 additional gemstone that you could spend on a future turn. Then the real meat of the game comes from these spaces here, these dwarfs with these letters, or these 2 question mark spaces, which are guessing spaces. So let's say that this green player moves onto a dwarf page or space. What they could do then is they could pick any other sculpture belonging to any other player. Let's say they pick this sculpture here. They would point to this sculpture and they could ask for any letter within that sculpture. For example, they might say, I want to know the first letter within the sculpture. And then the red player will, in secret, write down the first letter of that sculpture and show it only to the green player. So this is a saw. They would just write S on a piece of paper, show it to the green player. The green player now has some idea of what this might represent. So that would be the what you do on those 2 spaces. And then on these 2 spaces, you're going to do a round of questioning. And the way that works is, let's say the red player moves here, that initiates the questioning phase. And that's played over two phases, essentially. And what you do is you could pick any object or number of objects. You could alternate through them during the phase. And you could ask questions about them. So, for example, you could say, this object here, is it inanimate? And the player who created it would answer. And they can only answer in 1 of 4 ways. They could say yes, no, possibly, or do not know. So this is a baseball bat, so they would say yes. And now the red player would be able to continue to ask a question about something else. And these are open answers with every player hearing the question, every player hearing the answer. So as you're on this space, you're giving everybody information. So they might ask the player, is this inanimate? And the blue player would say no. As soon as you get a no answer, you would then end that first phase of the questioning. that moves on to the second phase. And here you could continue to ask questions until you get a no. If you get a no, that would just end your turn. Or you could make a guess about one of the objects. So let's say over a number of turns, the player has guessed, several things about, or found out several things about this object here, hearing other players' questions and perhaps getting letters about it. If they wanted to make a guess, they would simply write down what the object is. In this case, let's say they wrote down bat, B-A-T, baseball bat. They would show that to the other player, and the other player would simply say yes or no. If either way, the player's turn will end, but if the object was correctly guessed, then the player who created it would stick an arrow in it like that. So the first person to guess an object is going to get 5 points. So red would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. The second person to guess an object would, you'd stick a second arrow in it, and then that person would get 3 points. So let's say green guessed it later, they would get 3 points. And once an object has been guessed 2 times, which isn't a problem in a 3-player game, but becomes competitive in a higher player count game, it cannot be guessed any longer. So first person 5 points, second person 3 points. The person who created the object also gets or loses points based on the number of arrows that have been placed on the board as well. And that varies by the number of players. I printed out this little cheat sheet to show that, though. With 3 or 4 players, you could see if there's only 1 or 2 arrows, the player would go back 2 spaces. So this player, because they made an object that was so easy to guess, they're going to get penalized for that. But then, if you've made an object that's somewhere in the middle of the pack, you'll get positive points for creating an object that's not too easy, not too hard, but then it goes back to negative points for the last few objects again. So you could see the game essentially wants you to create sculptures that are not immediately identifiable, but that players will eventually be able to guess. So the game will just keep going like this until a player accumulates enough points to get onto this key, and that would be the winner of the game. The game would end immediately, or until a certain number of arrows have been placed among all players. So that's going to depend on the number of players, how many arrows get placed. And if that was the end of the game trigger, just the player that was furthest along on this track would be the winner. The game copy that I have does not come with these rules, but this is a very good house rule, and it's simply to say that if your object has 0 arrows in it, you lose 5 points, and if your object has only 1 arrow in it, you lose 2 points per object. And then you would evaluate the winner. And that would happen regardless of whether somebody reached the key or if the game ended because the number of arrows were placed. So that would just be a house rule that I suggest playing with. One other thing that I'll mention are these curse cubes. Again, these are optional. They're technically in the rules, but some players prefer to play without them. Again, each player is going to use 3 of them, and they can be used to play out of turn, essentially. So the way that works is you could just declare any time you'd like to use one. If 2 people declare they'd like to use one, you roll the die to see which player gets to use theirs. And they can be used to either get a letter about an object out of turn, or to make a guess about an object out of turn. And you get 3 of those to start. Once 5 of them have been spent, if ever you use your last one, you could take 3 back, and you could do that 1 time. So you'll have 3 and then another supply of 3 at a later point in the game for a total of 6 of those. And again, some people prefer not to play with those curse cubes, but they are part of the game rules. So in general, that is how Barbarossa will work. Okay, so that is Barbarossa, and this is a game that at its core is very, very fun. I think that the idea of sculpting things that are not so easy to identify that they're immediately apparent, but then are somewhat recognizable, and people will have a chance of ultimately identifying them as a unique challenge in this game. I think that the game has a lot of strange rules that haven't aged very well. Certainly the roll and move mechanism is not great, although you can mitigate that by spending those gemstones. And I think a lot of the ways that the game handles the scoring are different in various editions of the game. I've kind of Frankensteined house rules to play this game, and I think that most players would want to do the same. Certainly having some penalty if you just make a sculpture that nobody guesses makes the game work a lot better. my version of the game does not come with those rules, but they are present in some versions of the game. So that's why I explained those. And then also some people take objection to those cubes that allow you to break turn order. I think they're okay, but again, some people really don't like them in the game. Overall, I think that the game does still seem pretty unique, although I guess some games like Cluzzle have co-opted some of the ideas of this. But it's something that I think is somewhat shows its age just because of how it scores and how the game operates from turn to turn. And in fact, the same designer, Klaus Teuber, he released an updated version of the game entitled Dodals, and I would pretty much recommend that anybody who was interested in this game would get Dodals versus this one. It just streamlines the rules. It makes the game play a lot more smoothly. Instead of essentially having free reign over which objects you're going to guess and that determining the scoring of it, here each object essentially has its own track for scoring. So the value of your object getting evaluated is tied to just its own challenge, as opposed to when over the course of the game it gets evaluated. Here, if since you score negative points for having 2 arrows, if every other player simply spends times at the start of the game guessing your object, you will get negative points, not necessarily because it was any easier to guess, but just because other players have chosen to focus in on it. That's the one thing about this game that I don't really like, and Dodals does fix that because each object gets its own scoring track. And there are some other streamlined options in there as well. So the thing that comes up with players wanting to guess at the same time is mitigated in that, and so on. So Dodals is essentially an updated version of this. This is a game that I think at its core is very fun, but it's a little bit clunky to play. There's just better options whether you're playing Cluzzle or Dodals. So it's not necessarily the Spiel des Jahres game that has held up the best over time, but it certainly has been influential on other party games, not just games that involve clay, but also games like Dixit, which uses a very similar scoring mechanism taken from this game. So it's a very weird game, and I think it's a testament to the designer, Klaus Teuber, that he could design something like this and go on to design something like Catan or something like Wacky Wacky West or whatever. So he's won several Spiel des Jahres games, all for very different games, and that's pretty incredible in itself. So those are my thoughts, I would say, on Barbarossa. And thanks for watching.